Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today, unfortunately, this is going to ruin your day because this is the most depressing lesson in history class every year. I always hate having to talk about this. It's one of the most important lessons that we have every year, but it's also one of the saddest because it's an event in history that has had um, that was one of the most senseless and meaningless uh, acts of evil in the history of the world and caused suffering in a way that is almost unprecedented in history. And of course, today we're talking about the Holocaust. And so, in our last videos, we kind of looked at kind of how World War II, finished out, but we hadn't really gone back and talked about, how the Holocaust began or what really it was. So, you'll remember from when we talked about the rise of Hitler that a major part of what Hitler did was use the Jews as a scapegoat. He blamed them for the defeat of Germany in World War One. He blamed them for basically everything that had gone wrong in Germany. And why would Hitler, pick on the Jews as a scapegoat here? Well, a lot of that has to do with the fact that there is a long history of anti-Semitism in European history, and especially in German history. So while it reaches its peak here in the 1940s, it didn't come out of nowhere. There was this long-running dislike and at times hatred of the Jews that had gone on for centuries. It's a strange thing because Europe was mostly a Christian civilization, and we literally worship a Jewish man who we believe was God come in the flesh, Jesus Christ. So you would think that would make a difference in the Jews' favor, but in actuality, there got to be this strain of anti-Semitism within certain eras of church history that actually, held it against the Jews that they were the ones that killed Jesus. They called them the Christ killers. Well, guess what? The Roman Empire had a lot to do with that as well, and so did your personal sins, sir. So, that was always a very unfair thing to single out the Jews in that, but that had been a part of the discourse in Europe for years. Of course, there was a certain amount of envy of the Jews because they've always been able to kind of succeed everywhere they went, which caused a lot of people who want a scapegoat for all of the world's problems to kind of treat them as though they were, the masterminds of everything that went wrong. And conspiracy theory thinking is always kind of oftentimes aligned with this idea of the Jews pulling strings behind the scenes to control the world and all this kind of thing. And throughout the Middle Ages, we've mentioned here before that a lot of times kings would get a certain public relations boost from expelling the Jews from a territory because throughout much of the Middle Ages, Jews were allowed to charge interest on loans, Catholics were not, and so everyone had to go get loans from Jews. So if you drove the Jews out, people's loans got canceled. So that kind of helped build. Kings started to realize, I can keep kind of playing the people off against the Jews and make myself look good to the people for political reasons. There's all kinds of just horrible, horrible slanders that were spread around the Jews. When the Black Death happened, the worst epidemic the world's ever known, back in the 1300s, there were rumors that the Jews were behind that, or that the Jews had caused that to happen. As ridiculous as that hopefully sounds to you, there was something called the blood libel, where people literally believed, it was commonly believed in Europe, that Jews literally drank the blood of Christian children and used it to in the making of matzo balls for Passover. I mean, just truly insane thought processes. And we saw a number of major anti-Semitic incidents in the 1800s. If you remember us talking about the Dreyfus Affair in France, where a Jewish captain or figure in the French army was falsely charged with treason and railroaded and falsely accused. The pogroms in Russia, where one of the czars, I want to say it was Alexander II, persecuted the Jews pretty severely, drove a lot of them out of Russia, and that's many of those Russian Jews came to the United States, as a matter of fact. Um, so there had been recent flare-ups of anti-Semitism throughout Europe in the 1900s or the 19th century, excuse me, which would be the 1800s. And that part of that is what inspires Theodor Herzl, the father of Zionism, to say, this whole living as strangers in Europe thing is not working out too well. Maybe we should start our own Jewish country again. And that is, of course, a dream that's going to be realized in the immediate aftermath of World War II with the foundation of the State of Israel. But in the meantime, you've got all this anti-Semitism that's been kind of floating in the air throughout generations of European history, and Hitler is the one who weaponizes it more than anyone else ever has, and in doing so releases a wave of suffering that's almost unprecedented in the history of certainly the modern world, if not the world altogether. And so Hitler, on his way to power, he had written this book, Mein Kampf, which was hundreds of pages of conspiratorial rantings and, racist propaganda, and particularly anti-Semitic, meaning anti-Jewish propaganda, kept blaming them for everything. And when Hitler comes to power, along with him comes a propaganda minister by the name of Joseph Goebbels, who's famous for the quote that, you can say any lie long enough, loudly enough, and people will begin to believe it. And he practiced what he preached. He lied loudly and often, and used, the official apparatus of the German state to spread his ideas that were lies. But and within Hitler's inner circle, you have some of the worst people that's ever. Obviously, Hitler himself is one of the worst people who's ever lived. At his side, the head of the group called the SS, which was kind of Germany's. I was about to say they were one of Germany's kind of elite guards, but they're really more like Hitler. They really answered to Hitler the man more so than the government of Germany, the nation. Although those two things are obviously really intertwined, it being a totalitarian dictatorship. And the guy in charge of the SS is a man by the name of Heinrich Himmler, and he's going to be the one who actually kind of oversees and manages the Holocaust. Underneath him is a man by the name of Reinhard Heydrich, who was so ruthless a man that I heard somewhere along, I can't remember the source. I remember watching some documentary or something where people said even Hitler and Himmler, who were again two of the worst people that have ever lived in history, were occasionally disturbed by Heydrich, which is not a good sign, to say the least. Also within the Nazi apparatus, you're going to have. I've never known if I'm pronouncing his name right, but I think it's Joseph Mengele, I think is how you say it. It might be Mengele. Maybe it's Mengele, who is responsible for a lot of just terrible human experimentation on Jews in these concentration camps, and causes a tremendous amount of suffering and torturous things. So there's some truly, truly despicable human beings inside. The whole leadership apparatus of the Nazi Party, obviously, and were just horrible, horrible, horrible human beings on every level. So how do they kind of begin persecuting the Jews? They kind of ease their way into it. So, they start off by really kind of treating the Jews as though they were. Some people might use treating them as the other, trying to say they're not Germans, they're not real Germans, and trying to make them stand out and be distinctive in a different way so that they could not be considered regular people. Because ultimately, the long game of the German propaganda plan was to increasingly convince people that the Jews are animals, that they're not human, they're certainly not Aryan, which was Hitler's idea of the master race. For instance, I was gonna send you a clip of, excuse me. I saw the guy kind of explaining the psychology of getting the German people used to the Holocaust, but I couldn't find one that was shorter that explained it short enough and in kind of grade level terms that you'd understand. But the long and short of it is they really kind of push this idea of the Jews as dirty. They push this idea of the Jews being behind everything bad that happens. Um, they they created this idea that because a lot of the Jews made their money in finance and things like that, that they were therefore uh, uh, lazy or thieving, and that sort of thing, and just pushed all these just terrible dehumanizing lies. They started making them to help make them look like not regular Germans. They started making them wear stars of David on their clothes to mark them as a Jew, uh, and a number of other things to kind of communicate the idea that the Jews were not good. Or they start, the Nazis start leaning on German pastors basically to throw out the Old Testament because the Old Testament is all about the Jewish people, and they didn't want anyone coming away from the Bible with the idea that the Jews might be special or human. So they really required, if you wanted to stay in the good graces of the German church as a minister, well, you basically had to stop preaching the Bible and preach Nazism from the pulpit. And a shocking amount of people actually did that because they were more concerned with their position than doing what was right. And it's a real stain in parts of church history, although there were a lot of Germans who also, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who famously kind of resisted what Hitler was trying to do there, and they formed what they called the Confessing Church, which kind of refused to go along with that idea. But so they're trying to make it to where there's no source of good news about the Jews anywhere. They want everything that's expressed in public about the Jews has to be negative, and they start setting them apart, and marking them with different clothes and stuff like that. And they start doing a lot of mass deportations of Jews to other nations when possible. One day they deport a Jewish fellow to Poland, and his nephew, who's living in France, gets word of this, and angry at the way that the Jews are being treated, and angry at the fact that his family was being torn apart unnecessarily to no wrongdoing of their own. He took it out on a German official there in France. This is before the war really started. Late 30s. I think it was 37. Let me double check. 38. So I guess the war was maybe just starting to pick up here. No, I guess it would be. I guess the war started really in 39 in Europe. So this is right before war. Well, this event really enrages the German people. The Nazis use it for maximum propaganda value. And what happens is a terrible, terrible night that is known in German as the Kristallnacht, which translates to the night of broken glass. And on the night of the Kristallnacht, the Nazis basically gave the German people the green light to go harass Jews, beat them up, break the windows of their businesses, which is where the night of broken glass comes from, burn their businesses to the ground, rob them, abuse them, and you wind up with a number of Jews dying. Let me see if I can get the exact number from the textbook here. The textbook doesn't say, but a number of Jews were killed. Many more lost everything they had. Their businesses were destroyed. And it's really the beginning of moving rapidly towards more and more extreme measures against the Jews. The next thing that happens after the Kristallnacht is the Germans kind of rearrange their cities to funnel all the Jews into one area, which became known as the ghetto, and that's actually where that term comes from. That has its roots in the Jewish experience before it was used in other contexts in more recent years. So they forced all the Jews into ghettos, and they walled them off. They literally put barbed wire around the ghettos and big borders around them, and kind of had the Jews trapped and stuck inside of the ghettos. And basically, we were going to let them kind of sit in there and wait to die. And there was some resistance to this, particularly in Warsaw, which was the capital city of Poland. And then when Germany takes over Poland in the opening weeks of World War II, that becomes German territory for a season of time. And in the Warsaw, that's where they had what they call the Warsaw Uprising, which is one of the largest of the Jewish resistance movements to the Nazis. Many of them did take up arms and try to fight against German control, but there was only so much success that they had, although they bravely tried to do the right thing. So there's a period of time, where the Jews are kind of locked in the ghettos and kind of facing threat of eventual extinction, from starvation or things like that over time. Hitler, though, again, he deeply, deeply, deeply hates the Jews. And he is getting impatient with the pace at which they are dying. And then meanwhile, when you start getting into, after the American entry into war and stuff like this, the tide of the war starts to turn, and all of a sudden Hitler is kind of starting to be faced with the question of what's more important, killing a lot of Jews or winning the war? And the reality is Hitler prioritizes killing Jews. So he starts to divert tremendous amounts of his elite forces, the SS, away from the battlefield just as the moment that the Allies are starting to turn the tide in the war in order to facilitate killing these Jews, because he actually, when faced with the question, do I increase my chances of winning the war by sending everyone to the front, or do I, or do I, kill all the Jews I can while I can and take my chances on winning the war? He decides to kill as many Jews as possible. And this is the final step, is what he called the final solution. And this is the period of time that we know as the Holocaust. And so they start to set up these concentration camps. The idea of a concentration camp was where you take all of a certain population and force them into kind of one prison camp. It actually had been a British invention during the Boer War. America came kind of perilously close to doing that with the Japanese during World War II, where we did have the Japanese-American population of, especially the western states, in internment camps, which we talked about in a previous video. But these were even much more extreme than what had been done in British history or concurrently with in American history. No defense of Japanese internment in America at all, but the idea was not really to torture them, although I'm sure the living conditions weren't what they should have been, but the idea was probably to let them free at the end of the war or what have you. Here the Germans are, let's put the Jews in camps and use this as a way to kill them all. And in fact, and again, because he's prioritizing the death of Jews, he winds up killing more than enslaving them. If it was just a logistical thing, if you had no moral compunction or conviction at all, even if your conscience was seared, you still would expect that, it would be more militarily expedient to enslave them for longer periods of time. But instead, he really is focused on death. He does enslave the Jews, and they do have to work in the camps, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of forced labor inside the camps, but what would have been a rather large labor force is just they're constantly coming up with excuses to exterminate them. Is the language that they would probably use, because they were trying to dehumanize the Jews and make them seem like they were animals. And so the concentration camps, the most famous of which is Auschwitz, There's another one in Treblinka. But there another one in Dachau. But there really are a lot of concentration camps. There's I want to say at least about a dozen of these. Um, Auschwitz, which is located in Poland, was the largest and the most notorious. So what would begin to happen is the Jews they would be hauled off, picked up in the ghetto, oftentimes under false pretenses. A lot of times they would lie to them about where they're being taken and what's going on. Although, it doesn't take long before the Jewish people start to realize these people are being taken away and never coming back. They weren't idiots. They understood, that something terrible was happening. But, nonetheless, the Jews still did, not the Jews, the Germans did a lot of deceptive things as it related to the Jews. But they would take them, they would move them to these concentration camps, and when they would get in there, the Nazis would kind of separate them, men on one side, women on the other, and then from there they would separate the fit as they saw it from the weak as they saw it. And those that they deemed to be weak, they had no sympathy for at all, no compassion at all, and they just did away with them right away. If you were considered strong enough, you were sent to go be prison labor for a while until you got weakened to a particular degree. They lived in horribly crowded conditions. Literally sometimes having to sleep right on top of each other, not enough space. They would have room that might be able to, fit 12 people, and they'd cram 30 of them into it. Fed them bare minimum, soup, bread, water. Just bare minimum, just enough to keep them energetic enough to work. But still, many of them would starve to death. That was one of the major causes of death, was just the raw starvation. They starved the people so much, gave them such little food, that there are accounts that typically if someone were to accidentally spill a spoonful of their soup on the ground, they would take their spoon to the dirt and scoop it up rather than let it go to waste, because they were that famished. It's hard to talk about some of this stuff. So just horrible conditions. And if you showed any sign of weakness at all, you're carrying something and you give out and you can't carry it anymore. It was your life. And sometimes they'd shoot you on the spot. But probably the most famous way that they took lives at Auschwitz, in some of these other camps, was through the gas chambers. And so what they would do, and this is just so cruel. Let me back up and say again, because I've talked about one of the themes of kind of the German propaganda was trying to dehumanize or animalize the Jews. One of the first things that Hitler does when he becomes chancellor was he started a sanitation campaign on the streets, of Germany, and tried to wipe out a lot of the rodents and stuff using Zyklon B, which was a particular poison that. And then years later, because by now he's pushed this thing of the Jews are vermin, the Jews are rodents, the Jews are not real people. He then actually kills the Jews with the same poison, Zyklon B. And when it was time for them to go, they would actually lie to them and say they were going to a shower. And you got to put yourself in the situation. You're in this bad of sanitation. You haven't heard that. You haven't been able to take a shower in weeks while you've been working yourself to death in these terrible conditions. And so they give them this little glimmer of hope that you're going to go to the shower. And then while they would go into the shower, they would release this gas to the shower head, and they would choke to death and die. When you think about the fact that Hitler was a man who had survived a poison gas attack in World War One himself, and then to think that he would okay using poison gas against civilians. I mean, that's a twisted evil man. And so typically, the deaths were so significant. They started by having these large mass graves. They would just dig a big pit and just throw the bodies in naked one by one, because a lot of times they would steal their clothes. A lot of times they would steal. A lot of times, if they had like gold fillings in their teeth, they would literally steal the teeth out of people. After a while, burying them all became impractical, even though they had one mass grave where it's literally just stacking bodies on top of each other. But even that got to be hard to find adequate land for it. So they started, just built these massive industrial strength ovens to use as mass crematoriums, and they started to just incinerate them. It's very, very, very disturbing. And by the time the whole thing is completed, more than 6 million people were dead in the Holocaust. And I don't even know if that statistic is just 6 million people or if that's 6 million Jews specifically. There were a few other people who were brought into the Holocaust as well. So you have the Jews, most famous, but also the Gypsies were brought into the Holocaust. A lot of some Russian POWs. There were various people who had opposed the state, homosexuals, a lot of times people that had any kind of disability. If you were mentally challenged in any kind of way, or if you had certain handicaps, they would send you to the camps. And a lot of this is connected to, the Germans were, there was an idea that kind of swept. I talked about it in American history, but I don't know if I really talked about it much in this class because we've been via distance or most of the 20th century now. But there was an idea that kind of caught on across a lot of the Western world in the 1900s, 1910s called eugenics, which was this idea of using sterilization, population control measures, and things of the such, in an attempt to basically improve the gene pool as they saw it, and it led to atrocities in a number of countries in the Western world, even in the United States. They got shockingly popular for a stretch in the 1900s, right before World War One. That's partly responsible for the eugenics movement. Actually, is a big part of how legal abortion happened. In America, because Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood, the world's largest abortion provider, largely started advocating for abortion largely for the sake of reducing America's African American population. And so there was a kind of racial genocidal root to that whole organization. So Hitler and the Nazis were very much into this eugenics idea, and so they and they pushed it all the way to, don't just sterilize certain populations or prevent them from having children, but exterminate as they would say, the ones that are already there. And so obviously the Jews were the biggest victims of it, but there's a number of other groups as well that they wanted to get rid of. When all was said and done, about 60% of the people that went into the camps died. The other 40% were absolutely traumatized in ways that are almost impossible to kind of get your mind around if you had years of your life or even a week of your life that was like that. I mean, it was extraordinarily painful thing to go through. When the war was over, there was a little bit of an attempt to bring some of the people that had been involved in this stuff to justice. There was a trial known as the Nuremberg trials, where many people were charged with war crimes. before an international jury. Over and over again, the defense that was offered by those people at Nuremberg was, their excuse overwhelmingly was, I was just following orders. And if there's ever been a time that kind of illustrated the principle that you can't just follow every order and assume that you're, ethically okay and right with God, I mean, this would be the one. But a number of the people that were some of the worst masterminds of all this stuff wound up escaping. A lot of them moved to South America. Israel, when Israel becomes a nation, they actually take it upon themselves to try to arrest the rest of these Nazi war criminals. And one of the most notorious being a fellow by the name of Eichmann. And so Israeli Mossad, Israeli Special Forces, actually tracked this Eichmann character down inside of South America. I think it was in Argentina, if I'm not mistaken. But they actually track him down in the 50s or 60s, I want to say, and bring him in to be tried in an Israeli court. So there were some attempts to bring some of this to justice, but there's no way to undo the damage that was done. I mean, it's literally 6 million people that are dead, which was a tremendous percentage of the Jewish population in the world. I mean, if you factor in the fact that these people would have been able to have children, and then the children those children would have had. I mean, what the Holocaust really did to the Jewish people was destruction on a scale that it's impossible to just say, oh, it's 6 million. It's 6 million lives that would have created millions more lives. So you've got family lines that would have extended for generations that are just wiped out. And so who knows? I mean, without the Holocaust, the Jewish people as a group today would probably be, conservatively 5 or 6 times larger a population worldwide than it is, and it's just really tragic what happened to them. So I mean, I guess anytime you talk about the Holocaust, I mean, the big question is why? How does this happen? And I think if people that want to believe in a moral relativism, that want to say that there is no real right and wrong, or that right and wrong is just determined by what you feel like, or that who am I to judge? I think nothing's really evil. It's just all it takes is looking into the eyes of what happened at the Holocaust for a moment to say, no, there is a such thing as evil. There is a such thing as evil, period. You wouldn't think that people would have to be reminded of that, but there's a lot of philosophies around the world that would want to minimize how big a deal evil is. But no, evil is real. And I think, why does this happen? Just looking at this from a Christian perspective, I do think there just has to be a satanic or demonic element to this. Even as a firm believer in the idea that man's naturally depraved without regeneration and all that, even just believing that we we're born into sin and are inherently flawed until Christ remakes us. I understand all that, but even with that, this is just not ordinary behavior, to a great extent. Although then again, you say that there's genocides happening in the world today. There's all kinds of racial violence and genocide throughout history. So maybe I'm overstating that, but this doesn't seem normal. I mean, I think there is absolutely a different kind of demonic involvement in some of this stuff because, and I think some of that is, I think Satan probably resents the Jewish people in kind of a different way because they are the people that gave birth to the Messiah and kept the law of God for thousands of years while the rest of us were off worshiping trees and rocks. So I think there's an element of that, but you can't just say the devil made me do it either because he can't. And the reality is a lot of the people that played a role. I mean, obviously we can point out the leadership in Himmler and Heydrich and these people and say, okay, these are just exceptionally wicked men that stand out, that you would know, that you could see them in the in the store and know something's off with this guy. But the reality is, a lot of the people that carried this stuff out were people that probably seemed really normal, if you saw them outside of the camp, and yet a lot of ordinary Germans went along with this. There were some Germans that opposed it and hid Jews in their closets and stuff like that, or hid Jews from police. And you've seen them make some movies out of some of the people that did that. Corrie ten Boom's The Hiding Place, kind of famous book about a family that, Schindler's List, the great movie about a businessman that tried to, smuggle people out of the concentration camps. Very powerful movie, disturbing to watch, but that's the, it is what it is. It's a movie about the Holocaust. But those stories are the exceptions, not the rule. I mean, the overwhelming amount of people in Germany either silently supported it or opposed it silently, but did nothing to stop it. And of course, it's easy to sit there and judge the ones that didn't do anything to stop it, but you got to remember, you would have been in fear as well, because the Nazis were not people that really valued freedom of speech and expression of opinions contrary to, the Nazi ideology, particularly if you're talking about trying to convince people to have some kind of sympathy for the Jews that they were blaming for every terrible thing that's ever happened in the world. So, so that to me is really the real mystery, though, is how so many people could do nothing about what happened. And yet, oftentimes it's often human. Everywhere where this has happened in the world, there's always been an extent to which people just kind of allowed it to happen. And the reality is, though, a lot of people would have had to have been in favor of at least this way of thinking about it, even if they didn't want to go straight to death camps. Hitler never could have won it, because, Hitler was elected. Now, once he got in there, he took emergency powers. He blamed the communists on for starting the fire at the Reichstag, and said, we can't have any more elections because there's too much going on, and I need emergency power. And then he never gives it back. But at first, Hitler was elected. People voted for him. People wanted it. Did they know it would go as far as it did? I don't know, but if they thought it wasn't going to go that far, they were fools, because he talked about it in Mein Kampf. He talked about it in his book. He's right there in the book, blaming them for everything and talking about how he wants to wipe them off of the face of the earth, and restore German power through military conquest, and restoring this ethos of conquering the world and everything. For the sake of German national pride and all this stuff. And the people ate it up. The people supported him. It's a hard thing to think about. It's a hard thing to deal with, because a lot of people who just didn't who ordinarily weren't even paying attention to public affairs, and it wasn't a big thing, just kind of silently went along with him doing what he's doing. And we need to learn from that. We can't... it's very cliche now, and there's some people even question if it's a real quote, but there's a quote that was famously attributed to Martin Niemöller, who was a German pastor, that he talked about, they came for the Jews and I did nothing because I wasn't a Jew, and then they came for the communists and I did nothing because I wasn't a communist, and he lists a couple more things like that, and then finally he says, and then they came for me and there was no one there to speak for me. And whether he actually said that or not, the point of the quote still stands, that people just kind of quietly acquiesced to usurpation of people's rights, to mistreatment of groups that they weren't a part of, and just kind of a let it go and let it go until finally it reached the point where we saw, maybe the greatest tragedy in history. So that's the difficult thing about the Holocaust, is knowing unbelievable in just the amount of raw evil, the amount of raw cruelty and hatred that drove it is stunning, and yet a lot of people let it happen. And what's interesting, a lot of people, at these Nuremberg trials tried to defend themselves by saying, I was just following orders. I mean, that's what a soldier does in a war, right? Germany's at war. And our commanding officer said it was for the good of the country to put this gas into the shower head. So I did it. And I think this is proof of the fact that even though it's ordinarily the right thing to do to follow the law and honor authority and so on, you have to understand that, there is a line where it becomes sin to follow orders. In the book of Exodus, it's typically a sin to disobey the king. But when Pharaoh says, kill all the Hebrew boys, and some of the midwives help save the Hebrews, they're considered heroes for doing that in the Exodus story. So you have to know that you can't be all right with God by saying, "Oh, I was just doing what someone else told me to do," even if that person is a leader in a national sense or any other kind of authority. So all authority is limited by God's word to a certain extent. So a psychologist in the 1950s in America was fascinated by this answer that people gave. And he kind of wondered how many ordinary people would actually kill someone if an authority figure told them to. And so he actually set up an experiment where this is back in the 50s, which is kind of like the peak of people trusting in scientists or whatever, And so he set up a fake science experiment, and he had people that were in on it who were wearing white lab coats with the little lapel pins and clipboards and the whole thing, walking around looking very authoritative. And the study was on whether applying electric shock to people who get answers wrong on a test would help people learn better. So he hired actors to pretend to be the shock victims. They knew what they were doing. The people that were pulled off the street to be a part of this assignment did not know what was happening. And they were given like a row of red buttons with various levels of intensity. Like they were numbered like 1 through 10 or 1 through 20 or whatever it was. And then the last button, there was like a big X on, like it said, like, lethal, do not press. And their job as the volunteer is to press the button, and then the guy on the other side of it is not really getting shocked, but he's pretending to because he's a professional actor. And the first person who presses the button, he kind of gives one of these. And then he presses a second button, and it gets a little worse. And then he starts going, ah! He starts wincing. And then he starts shouting, and until when you start getting to several levels up, he's screaming and begging for mercy. And the whole time, this authoritative figure is standing there in a white coat and taking notes, and is like, press the, sir, it's very important that you press the next button. This is important research for the national security. And, and the guy's like, I can't do it. And he's like, sir, your country needs you. You need to press the button, And he keeps doing this over and over. And so what they found out is that up to a third of the people were willing to press the lethal button if asked. When they asked them, press the button that says lethal, a third of the people pressed the button. Now, the person didn't die because it was fake. But it discovered that many people were willing to go along with that if someone in uniform was telling them to. And it was a very controversial study. It breaks every kind of psychological ethics thing possible. Several of the people literally wound up committing suicide because they couldn't live with themselves after finding out kind of what was in them. Um, but it was a very, very revealing experiment, one of the most revealing experiments in the history of psychology. So why am I talking about that? Um, just to build, just to help us get into uh, a better understanding of the fact that a lot of very average people became a part through their silence and sometimes through their active cooperation. Became a part of something that was truly one of the most evil and horrific things that has ever happened in the history of the world. And that's a very sobering thought. So I know this is difficult material, uh, you know, uh, but it's something that we need to be aware of because there's a certain capacity for sin and for cruelty that is within humanity that we need to be aware of, and we need to be vigilant not to allow. Um, the Holocaust never could have happened if generations of ordinary Germans had pushed back against um, judgmentalism and hatred towards the Jewish people. And their willingness to hold on to grudges and resentments, and their judgment and their desire, the need to have someone to blame for why we lost World War I, because we can't just say we lost the war. That we have to say someone betrayed us, someone sold us out. And Hitler happened to point at the Jews because people, had already had that history of anti-Semitism, and he points at the Jews and says, they're the ones that lost us the war. And so everyone says, you're the ones that lost us the war. And before you know it, because people wouldn't deal with that seed of hatred in Matthew chapter 5, I think it is, 5 or 6, Jesus says, that you've heard it said, "Do not commit murder," but I say unto you, if you hate a man without a cause, you've committed murder in your heart. And so, generations of Germans nursed murder in their hearts before one generation finally actually did it. And that's a kind of sobering thing to think about. Anyway, this is a difficult video to make. I'm sure it was difficult to listen to, but I hope you'll put some thought into that, and I hope everyone's doing all right. I'll hopefully see y'all soon. Bye.